Hi class and welcome back to Social Psych. Today we're going to cover chapter 11, Living in a Prejudiced World. Note that this chapter is going to be pretty short and it's kind of just a supplementary chapter of what we talked about in chapter 10, Stereotyping, Prejudice, and Discrimination. So we're going to talk about a couple different theories here and then briefly kind of go into some more modern research on what happens with discrimination, mistreatment, and eventually talking about these kind of reactions towards changing demographics. But the first thing I'd like to talk about kind of goes back to the fact that we're monkeys, right? So like other monkeys, we are hierarchical in nature. We tend to think of the world as kind of there are people who are above us and people who are below us. And so we fall into this structure. Some people, more than others, are going to embrace this, right? Some people are going to argue that we should dominate the lesser status people and that's okay. And I mean, it's one thing if you're saying like, I should take care of my child, right? Because I'm bigger than her. But it's another thing if I'm saying this in terms of race or sex. This is a problem. And what we know is people who highly endorse this high social dominance theory to go, yeah, this makes a lot of sense. They tend to be more likely to believe in these legitimizing myths, right? That support the status quo. Something like, oh, this is just what women are supposed to do type thinking here, right? And so specific stereotypes that keep groups in their places, not letting this equity flow here. What's interesting is that in nature, hierarchies are always based on age and gender. Doesn't matter where you are. Gender might be male focused, typically, with humans, though it's not always. There are some female-led hierarchies out there. Age, typically we defer to the elderly, but there are other things, and we call these arbitrary sets. So things like money, for instance, socioeconomic status in America. Your skin color might determine certain hierarchical advantages or disadvantages that you have, right? And especially if you are high on the social dominance theory or what we call the social dominance orientation scale. So if you are high on this social dominance orientation, you tend to focus more on in-group favoritism, right? Okay, so I like people who are like me, and you're more likely to follow a career that reinforces these hierarchies, that some people are better than others, or some people deserve to be higher or lower in status. Compare that to people low in social dominance orientation, where these have less in-group favoritism, and they tend to focus on careers that are more hierarchy removing or attenuating. So instead of police, being a social worker. Instead of going into public prosecution, doing public defense, still in law, but a way different way of seeing this. And so this social dominance theory actually is kept in place in a couple ways. We can individually discriminate against one another. Individuals in dominant groups act poorly towards people in lower groups. We can talk about institutional discrimination, the idea that our institutions, our laws, our governments, our ways of being might change that and preserve a hierarchy. It wasn't for 100 years, until 100 years ago that women were allowed to vote. And that's an institutional discriminatory practice. And there's also behavioral asymmetries. This deference is shown to members of dominance, but not subordinate groups. Really interesting one that used to happen to me was I ran a couple experiments that were kind of medical focused. So I had to wear scrubs. And anytime I wore scrubs, people would get out of the way for me. So they would be like, oh, he's part of this really important group. I should move out of the way because he's a doctor. I'm not that kind of doctor, and it didn't actually make a difference here. And so these behavioral asymmetries also come about due to self-fulfilling prophecies. Things like, oh, you're this group, which means I'm impressed that you're even doing as good as I thought you would. That kind of thinking, right? So you throw so good for a girl kind of says that, oh, I don't expect girls to throw good. I treat girls and boys differently. So looping back to chapter 3, the self a little bit, we talked about system justification theory, the idea that when things go wrong, we're motivated to imagine the world as fair, the world as just, the world as good. And that doesn't matter if we are high or low in status, but when things go wrong, we like to imagine the world as fair and that things are going to be okay. You'll see a belief in a strict meritocracy as kind of a high social dominance orientation thing. And this is the idea that it's only your merit, it's only your hard work that matters. And We know that's not the truth, right? This fails to account for differences in luck, opportunities, privileges, advantages you might have. And so, right, this is one way in which we could say, yeah, well, you just didn't work hard enough. We can also talk about the just world hypothesis, this belief that the world is just and fair, karma is good and it happens to people, right? Good things happen to good people, bad things happen to bad people. We get what we deserve. You're a lot better off thinking of that when you're, the big fish, but the world isn't always fair, right? What happens if I get my house broken into? Does that mean I'm a bad person? No, that might just have happened. And so what we actually see is that, right, high status individuals are more deserving as low status individuals, right? We like to imagine that because that helps us to feel a little bit more fair. This also, right, as we mentioned, supports legitimizing myths, these myths that, say that we should treat people unequally, right? Some people were, given God's gift to be a king, or that, right, if you work hard, the Protestants believe that if you work hard, God will reward you for your efforts. Moving on from there, what I'd like to talk about for a couple minutes here is how our faces affect us, right? And so part of this is just looking at somebody is going to very much change what you know about them and what you think about them. Within half a second of meeting somebody, you've already kind of distinguished a lot about that person, their race, their sex, their age-ish, and some other details. But you've also made some type of stereotypical judgment about them based on two dimensions. So this is the stereotype content model, and it assumes that based on these two dimensions, whether or not you think the person is warm, are they friendly, or are they an enemy, right? Warm being good, cold in this case being bad. Incompetence, are they able to achieve their goals or are they unable to achieve their goals, right? Like my daughter, right? She's not very competent as a little kid, right? But you would probably assume that she's very friendly if you saw her. So what happens when we measure these? Well, apologies for some of the words up here. This is what I've got to work with. But you can measure where different stereotypical groups fall here. And I'm not going to ask you, like, what do you think about housewives or Christians or whatever, but I am going to say that how would people who are considered, right, high in competence and high in warmth, these people who we think are able to do what they need to do and are kind, people like housewives, Christians, Irish, the middle class, Americans, Black professionals here. Well, we think of these people as pride-worthy. We admire those people. We like those people. However, what if these people aren't competent but are nice, right? So the elderly or individuals with disabilities. Well, typically our stereotypes for them tend to be more about pity, like, oh, they're kind, but they can't do it at what they need to. Moving down here, talking about white people, British, Jewish individuals, Asian individuals, rich people. I'm working with what I got, guys. We tend to envy these people, right? Other groups, people who aren't in these groups tend to envy these, right? Because why? Well, maybe I feel like I'm a nice person and I feel competent in myself. So I might think, well, I deserve that. Lastly, we have people who we don't find competent and we don't find warm. And we treat these people with contempt, right? So we're really against these. They throw feminists in here, which I don't fully get. This is a weird one here. But it's important to note that with these, right, especially as I'm talking about envy and contempt, that contempt really quickly can lead us down this very bad road to what we talk about as dehumanization. And so dehumanization is the idea to deny the full humanness to another human. To think that, right, to call somebody a dog, or like the Germans called the Jews rats or vermin. Really taking away these human traits here, this intelligence of people, the ability to communicate language and our subtle emotions, right? Because we all know that, well, at least I believe that most animals have things like happiness, anger, sadness. But humans, right? Humans are the ones that have regret, that have pride. And if you are treating another group as non-human, this can go really south really quickly, because it's a lot easier to kill an ant than it is a human, because we don't think ants are necessarily as intelligent, as able to communicate, or having these subtle emotions. What happens if you think another human is like that? it leads to some really bad things. Flip that around, though. Another thing that's worth mentioning is anthropomorphization or anthropomorphism, the idea that sometimes you will see a non-human entity and think of it as human, right? Wilson from Castaway here is a great example. We are more likely to anthropomorphize things that look more human. Throw a pair of googly eyes on something and you'll see it. But there is a limit, and that's called the uncanny valley, right? A lot of robots all of a sudden stop sounding human, even though they do, or even looking human, even though they are human. And part of this is believed to be related to some kind of non-conscious understanding that maybe this person looks dead and we don't want to deal with dead people. But that's neither here nor there. That's just one hypothesis. I'm not going to test you on anything like that. Okay, so as we're moving through, one thing we got to talk about is gender prejudice. And the book does a really good job of kind of explaining this in a way that I think is kind of funny. The fact of the matter is, every single culture shows some form of male status, whether that is males have a higher status or males have a lower status. Typically, males have a higher status than most, but not always. But still, sexism exists. We know this. It exists in every culture. Contact isn't going to change this. We're with we're with both sexes throughout schooling, but there's still prejudice. So it can't just be contact. Well, I always found that interesting. One thing I'd also like to mention is this idea of masculinity versus femininity. We also think, right, we typically think of men as masculine, women as feminine, but maybe that's not the best way of breaking this down. Well, what if there's certain qualities of masculinity that women have, and there's certain qualities of femininity that men have? And maybe that's a better way to think of that. And so what we've actually done is we've taken that masculine-feminine dimension and broken it down into two. So instead of going across, right, feminine to masculine, we are talking about two dimensions: agency, so being able to do something, right? Think like a secret agent on a task, on a mission. Then you've got communality, right? So communality kind of being part of a group. Men typically are seen as more agentic, right? More assertive, controlling, dominant, confident, whereas women are seen as more communal, gentle, sensitive, nurturing, and helpful. But this helps explain why some men are more communal and, right, you maybe wouldn't call them feminine, but also why you can think of like the example of like a tomboy is just a girl with higher agency than most other girls. You can always think of it that way. Now, there is this sense of ambivalent sexism, right? So typically towards women here, but this incorporates hostility towards women who violate what is considered normal for that gender, right? So the idea is that this is benevolent sexism for those that follow the norms. So if I believed, and I don't, that women belong in the kitchen type thing, I would be really kind towards women who followed that, right? You're rewarded for following norms in this case because we're keeping you in this unequal status quo. But if you start to fight against that, go against the norms, people are more likely to engage in hostile sexism, punishing you for not following the norms. And this technically works in both genders. You could imagine if a man was playing with dolls at a boy was playing with dolls at like 10 or 15, there's probably a chance that they're more likely to be punished for not following those. Women and men both endorse hostile and benevolent sexism, but what's fascinating is the more nationally average sexist your country is. If you live in a country that tends to have more sexism, there tends to be greater gender inequality in terms of pay. Fascinating here. To kind of wrap this up, it's important to note that right, there are differences between men and women. I can't have a baby. That's pretty much it, though. Right? As a dad with a daughter, right, I find it very fascinating that like my daughter can technically do more than me. But there's a couple ways in which we can think about why there are these social biases against this. Well, part of it is that women tend to have more of the investment put onto them. They got to carry the kid for 9 months. So women might be more concerned about things like their partner's social status and ambition, because men only really care about attractiveness. Yikes. There's a social role theory I like to talk about here, the idea that almost all of our behavioral differences between men and women are the result of these social roles, these cultural stereotypes, these beliefs we think we should have. I find this fascinating because my daughter told me recently that at 3.5 that I can't wear a dress. I'm a boy and boys don't wear dresses, right? So she's already gained this social role that boys and girls do things differently. And then there's a biosocial approach. This idea that, yeah, there's biological differences. The woman's got to carry the kid and she's got to deal with the aftermath of that, which is a lot. So there might be some other culturally moderated effects here. Right? Biology is the foundation, but there's inborn traits and characteristics of the baby which affect the way the parents behave. So if my daughter was a star athlete, it doesn't matter if she's a girl, I'm still going to probably push her that way. And it turns out that there are some sex differences that are backed up by meta-analyses that are true across a large portion of the population, that girls tend to show more effort at self-control than boys. Boys tend to be more active and intense, right? And that men are more physically aggressive and what we call heroically helpful. Men are more likely to be physically aggressive, but also help in very extreme one-off ways. Run towards the fire or, flip the car off somebody. Women, on the other hand, are more socially aggressive, more likely to start rumors, things like that. And they tend to be more helpful in the long term. So the way to think about that is, while a man is going to help you, on average, right? A man is more likely to help you if something really bad goes on. Their partner in a male-female relationship is probably more likely to actually check in on you and make sure you're okay down the line, if that makes any sense. Men tend to be more leaders in task-oriented groups, where women are better leaders at social-oriented groups. One thing I like to think about with that is the party planning committee from The Office, but that's neither here nor there. Now let's take a shift here and talk about discrimination and mistreatment. Just throw it in here. So I do understand that as a straight white man, I have specific advantages that go into my life. It's always interesting to teach on these topics as I find them very important, though I don't have as much experience. If there's any questions or thoughts that you have related to this, I'd love to chat with you. But that's all, just kind of a quick little blurb about me for what it's worth, because I want to talk about these ideas of how we can talk about mistreatment. So we can discriminate against people in a couple different ways. We can discriminate against them by doing something towards them. We can commit a crime, right? We can do this, we could add more policing to black neighborhoods or black people compared to white people. We can add something else. We can add worse sentences for people of color. We could also mistreat people by omission, absence of certain things. We can not give people what they deserve, not give them what they need, or, we can just remove this idea of hiring. So I'm not discriminating against you by treating you rude. I'm just discriminating against you by not giving you these resources, omitting what you should have. And the book goes through a lot of bias in law enforcement, right? The likelihood of dying by a law enforcement officer in the United States differs very much based on your age and your nationality. So there's bias in the law enforcement thing we can talk about. There's also bias in what's not there, right? So when we think about the Olympics, right, what do we see? We see athletes who are very healthy. We don't see, one, Paralympic athletes at the Olympics, and two, we don't see the Paralympics ever shown as big as the Olympics. It's not seen as important. And then, of course, bias in hiring, which we talked about, the fact that if you have a black-sounding name, your likelihood of getting a callback goes down compared to if you have a white-sounding name. And in this study, they used the same resumes, just changing the person's name. Now, not all of our prejudicial kind of prejudices are going to be out there, right? We're not able to necessarily know everything about something. You can't always look at somebody and tell that they're gay. Most of the time you can't, but there's some research to say that maybe you can. So it turns out that if you are trying to conceal your identity, imagine that you are gay and trying to keep that hidden, that's going to increase your cognitive load. What's going on in your mind? Because you've got to run everything past a new filter. Is this going to make me sound or seem gay? So what we see is that for people who are concealing, they need to know that they have allies here. And in this study, right, having a supervisor who was okay with having a gay employee, whether or not they knew this, made it less likely for people to, hide this knowledge of who they are or even just feel as negative about this. So, right, recognizing that holding these beliefs about yourself, especially if they're concealed, might actually be causing you a headache too, not physically, but more effort. And so, of course, we have stereotypes and biased perception. One of the classic studies is talking about how stereotypes link African Americans to crime. And this goes back to the implicit attitudes test. It's not necessarily that you grew up thinking this racist belief, but what have you, seen kind of associated in your life? And so in a fuzzy image study, we call this, what we do is we get a really, really fuzzy image, and slowly over time, over about 3 or 4 seconds, we make it less fuzzy until you can guess the image. And what we did beforehand was we either showed a white or black or no face before the fuzzy image, and then we asked you to hit pause when you think you could recognize the object. What do we find? Well, we find that when we look at the black prime here, it takes people only about 7 frames, not even near this, to be able to say, yeah, that's a gun when you see a black face first. What is happening? In your mind, you're pulling the association from black with crime. Now, I'm not saying that that is something you consciously agree with, but I am saying that's something that is probably linked in your mind. Notice that if there's no prime, right, no difference, and even white prime, right, people were actually less or slower on realizing that this was related to crime for a white person here. So saying that your stereotypes about this are going to matter, just like we talked with self-fulfilling prophecies here. We can also talk about institutional discrimination, not just individual discrimination, but the fact that certain practices like redlining of neighborhoods, not letting African Americans buy houses in certain neighborhoods, different penalties for drug use versus black versus white Americans. And actually, one of the most interesting ones is that cocaine is cocaine. Crack cocaine is a cheaper, less processed form of cocaine. It's used, for lack of a better term, it's used by the lower class. If you know Whitney Houston, crack is cheap, crack is whack. Now, on the other hand, there's powdered cocaine. This is a more processed cocaine. My understanding, I'm not a drug user, but right, this is going to be something that tends to be used more by rich or, it turns out, white people. And so cocaine is cocaine, right? But what we find is that if African Americans are disproportionately using crack over powder, and we make the crimes for powder less than crack, you are going to basically cause an institutional discrimination and institutionally begin to discriminate by putting African Americans in prison for this longer time. The problem with all of this is we don't necessarily know if somebody's acting racist, sexist, whatever to us. We have difficulty knowing if, right, this negative feedback is because, right, is it, right, like in this case, if you went up for a job, is it because that you weren't qualified or you weren't the best candidate, or is it because, of your race or something like this? Really cool study looking at this. We give you feedback from a Confederate in an adjacent room, so next room over. And this Confederate was either white or black. However, we told the participant, the Confederate can see you through a one-way mirror or they can't, right? So this is kind of like your classic being at the police station and an interview room, right? That some people thought that the Confederate could see you. Some people thought that the Confederate couldn't see you. What we found was that if you got bad feedback as a white person, it didn't affect you. Black individuals, their self-esteem was only affected when the white Confederate couldn't see them, when there was no other excuse. But if there was an excuse, if the white Confederate could see them, the black individual could say, well, maybe it's because I'm black. Maybe it's not because I didn't do good. And they're able to use this kind of out to find a different way. Versus if this African American knows that it doesn't matter what the Confederate was, the Confederate doesn't see them, they're going to go, oh, maybe I didn't do as well. So that attributional ambiguity, when you're not sure what to attribute it from, was it due to my performance or was it due to my race? That's going to play a matter here too. Very quickly, finishing up with reactions to privilege, change, and progress. An interesting study took place a decade ago that told half of the white participants, we did a big study with a lot of different people, half of the white participants that the U.S. will become a majority minority country by 2042. Numbers are hard. So the idea is that we are telling people that white people aren't going to be the majority by 20-ish years from now. We don't tell the other half of people that. And then we ask them to rate their feelings towards other races. Well, this is interesting. So white people overall tend to like white people better than other groups. I mean, that's kind of in group. But you'll notice that in the control condition where we just kind of said, hey, how do you feel about these groups? They tended to feel pretty average, right? And you'll notice everybody is above half. Nobody is really negative. But in the racial shift condition, they don't like the groups that are coming up against them as much, right? This kind of goes back to realistic group conflicts. Not that this is going to cause it, but this is problematic to some people. And to kind of end on that, we have to look at the other side of this. The belief that many people think that the amount of progress the other groups have made over time is catching up. And so what is here is these upper lines are when you ask white people, hey, for a black person, how much, right, when you consider white people having on average, let's just say $100 to give you kind of an average, how much do black people have on average compared to white people? Well, back in 1963, the average white person said, black individuals have about half as much as white individuals, right? Their wealth is about half as much as white individuals. All the way up to perceived in 2016 about 90%, right? That the disparity is like $90 to $100. When you look at the actual data, the disparity is enormous. The disparity is like $10 to $100. And this is what we call the Marley hypothesis, actually for Bob Marley. And it's the idea that, well, when the dominant groups know less about other groups, we assume that they're doing well. And it comes from this quote from Bob Marley's Buffalo Soldier, right? If you know your history, then you will know where you're coming from. And so by having people learn about this, having people understand this, we're able to start to erode some of those false beliefs about progress and privilege. But again, that is kind of everything I have to cover today. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out. But hope you're all doing well, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.